The Amish have fascinated observers for generations. In Pennsylvania, they maintain a ubiquitous presence. Their conviction and resistance to modern life's debauchery commands respect. Encounters with them remain limited, but locals hold them in high regard, seeking them out for well-made furniture, construction projects, and their meats, vegetables, and baked goods. Weekly trips to their farmers' markets provide access to quality essentials their communities produce. Rural farms alongside Amish communities often develop friendly relationships. The Amish prove especially fair to deal with in business and social contexts. They help with farm work, and their neighbors provide transportation services in return. These relationships function as genuine friendships. What strikes observers as peculiar is their reluctance to discuss religion. Multiple people working with them on various construction projects report the same pattern. For some reason, that topic remains off limits. This could be specific to certain orders in southeastern Pennsylvania, from Lancaster to Philadelphia, but the pattern holds across different interactions. Research into their belief systems reveals people who have closed themselves off from the world's evils as much as possible. They exemplify John 17 verses 14 to 17, where Jesus instructs his followers to be in this world but outside of it. They follow Christ's words without modification. They don't alter them to accommodate modern sensibilities. Several examples illustrate this commitment. They refuse violence. They avoid government whenever possible, especially military service. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus instructs believers to turn the other cheek. They adhere to that noble gesture completely. They don't even believe in self-defense. The West Nickel Mine school shooting, also known as the Amish Schoolhouse Massacre, demonstrates just how nonviolent they are. In 2006, just outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, in a one-room schoolhouse, a shooter killed 6 little girls in cold blood. The details are disturbing, an absolutely horrific crime. What makes this tragedy interesting is the community's response to the murders. A grandfather of one of the girls killed in the attack instructed everyone to forgive the perpetrator on the actual day it happened. The father of one victim tried to calm everyone down, to pray for the shooter's soul. The community then reached out to the killer's family to comfort them. 30 members of that Amish community, including family of the victims, attended his funeral. This level of love cannot be comprehended by modern society and reveals much about who they are spiritually. They work with their hands and provide goods and services for humanity's benefit, just as Scripture intended. They have mastered this sentiment in ways modern society has abandoned. They do not take the adoption of new technology lightly. The New Testament doesn't focus much on technology other than instructing believers to be in this world but outside of it, or warning against loving the things in this world, though that could apply to nature as well. Specific text addressing the rejection of human invention proves difficult to locate. This could be part of their ordinances, or they could have drawn this from Enoch, where wicked technologies introduced to the Nephilim from fallen angels destroyed the world. Perhaps it's all of the above. Either way, they were correct. Television, internet, modern industry have led multiple generations away from spiritual foundations. They do not dress to impress or brag about success. They exhibit no hint of vain or prideful behavior. They wear plain clothes and no makeup. The New Testament is quite clear on this topic, as is Enoch, leaving no doubt as to why they don't have to think twice about it. The question becomes why others who identify as Christians engage in these behaviors. John 2 verses 16 to 17 instructs believers against succumbing to the pride of life. Romans 1 verse 21 warns against vanity or empty self-centered thinking that replaces reverence for the divine. James 4 verse 16 identifies boasting and self-glorification as forms of vanity that are deeply problematic. Matthew 6 verses 1 to 2 cautions against righteous acts performed for vanity or public praise. These behaviors are all vacant from Amish communities. They work together to improve the lives of their entire group. They don't compete with each other as modern society has been conditioned to believe is healthy and normal. If someone gets sick, the entire community chips in to pay for their health care, a stark contrast to prevailing social norms. They ensure every member of their community is well fed and has a home. The entire community contributes to its construction. Meanwhile, modern society struggles with the largest housing crisis in human history, all driven by greed. Since their churches don't have websites, examination of local Mennonite congregations in the area provides insight. They are also Anabaptist and millennial in theology but broke from the Amish around 1700 and became much more accepting of modern society, which they call the English. They still hold similar beliefs, but since they aren't closed off, embrace technology and actually worship in churches, their statement of faith can be found online. This doesn't mean Mennonites are the same as mainstream society. They hold Christ's teachings closer than the modern world. They typically don't wear fancy clothes, and everyday sins tolerated by others like divorce are unacceptable. Shunning is very real. Both groups embrace the Dordrecht Confession of Faith. It's a short read that deserves examination. It won't seem foreign to any studied Christian. There's nothing shocking. They simply take the teachings more seriously than most. They clearly embrace the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes, which is where they arrived at their stance on nonviolence, avoiding excess, vanity, and pride among other things. What's interesting is that the Dordrecht Confession of Faith asks believers to prioritize witness. It states that they must confess His name before men, a clear description of public witness. This language echoes Matthew 10 verse 32 and Romans 10 verse 9, which are core evangelical texts. In fact, if the original Anabaptists were like the Amish of today, their own founder would never have converted to Christianity because he would never have heard the words of Jesus Christ. So why would they ignore and deliberately reject this part of their own faith? Deeper investigation reveals they have a supplemental text to the New Testament, a book written in 1660 by Thieleman J. Van Brott called Martyr's Mirror. This book is a historical chronicle. What's interesting is the tense. It regularly and readily proclaims that they are in the latter part of the millennial reign and obviously admits that they are closing in on Satan's little season. Here's a quote from the book. "The time is near when Satan being loosed again will rage more furiously than ever against the saints." He followed that up with, "Satan will work under the cloak of liberty and ease." He was interpreting scripture but predicted the modern world with remarkable accuracy. Many believe the little season began in the year commonly called 1776, roughly 100 years after this was written. This text would certainly support that theory and would also confirm that they knew they were living approximately 900 years after the events of 70 AD. So this text beloved by the Amish claims that we are currently living in Satan's little season. Is that why they've closed themselves off? Perhaps they believe it's too late to save others, so it's worth trying. From their point of view, they follow the teachings of Jesus Christ to the best of their abilities. Others don't. This may seem harsh, but they don't modify the teachings to conform to the modern world, which bears Satan's signature on everything. The Amish haven't completely rejected technology. In recent years, they've even begun to embrace cell phones, combustion engines, and electricity for work. But they don't allow it to pollute their homes. They use the necessary tools to provide for their families, as noted in 1 Timothy 5 verse 8. But that's where it stops. For all other practical purposes, the Amish are exactly as they have been for hundreds of years. Where it gets interesting is that buggies, plows, hand tools, and even the clothes on their backs are technology, human inventions. It's that they reject technology. They picked a very specific period of time in which they stopped accepting new advancements. That period of time happens to coincide with what many believe to be the loosing of Satan. They could have chosen any period of time to start rejecting technology. But it appears to be right around 1800 with the textiles, the steel plow, the cotton gin. For such a spiritually obedient culture, the only reason to suddenly stop adopting new technology would be because they knew that Satan had taken control of the world. Why are the Amish closed off, difficult to discuss views with, if Christ repeatedly pleaded with believers to spread the word, and even their own statement of faith demands it? Why did they choose a date almost 250 years ago to stop embracing new technology? It would seem like a completely random date except for what patterns reveal today. They don't even have churches like the Mennonites. They congregate in each other's homes to worship, just as Romans 16 verse 5 instructs believers to do when Christian churches become synagogues of Satan, as most have today. They actually know it's the little season because they behave as the Bible tells believers to during this time. It makes sense knowing both their texts and behaviors that they know what time this is, and they exemplify the perfect example by which all should live. The question becomes why others aren't following suit. Their withdrawal from mainstream society, their refusal to engage in religious discussion with outsiders, their selective adoption of technology up to a very specific historical point, all these behaviors align with a coherent theological understanding of the current age. They've created communities that function according to principles outlined in Scripture, resisting the corrupting influences they believe permeate the modern world. They've maintained agricultural and craft-based economies that keep them self-sufficient and outside the systems they view as spiritually compromised. They've preserved social structures that prioritize community welfare over individual advancement. Their response to tragedy, as demonstrated in the schoolhouse shooting, reveals a level of spiritual maturity that baffles those outside their communities. Forgiving immediately, reaching out to comfort the killer's family, attending his funeral, these actions flow from deeply held convictions about the nature of forgiveness and love. They don't just profess these values. They live them even when the cost is almost unbearable. Their economic model deserves attention. When someone faces illness, the community pools resources to pay for care. When someone needs housing, the community builds it together. These aren't theoretical principles. They're practiced realities that have sustained their communities for centuries. They've solved problems that plague modern society, homelessness, medical bankruptcy, social isolation, through simple application of communal responsibility. Their rejection of vanity and pride manifests in every aspect of daily life. Plain dress eliminates status competition. Shared work eliminates hierarchies based on wealth. Community decision-making eliminates power concentration. They've structured their society to minimize the very behaviors Scripture warns against. Their approach to technology reveals sophisticated discernment. They don't reject all tools and innovations. They carefully evaluate each one for its potential to disrupt their values and community bonds. A tool that helps provide for family gets approved. A device that would isolate individuals or introduce worldly influences gets rejected. The timing of when they stopped adopting new technology speaks volumes. Right around the period when industrialization began accelerating, when mass production started replacing craftsmanship, when urbanization began fragmenting communities, they drew a line. They preserved a way of life that maintains human-scale relationships, meaningful work, and spiritual focus. Their supplemental texts provide the theological framework for these decisions. Martyr's Mirror grounds them in the history of persecution and faithfulness. It reminds them of the cost previous generations paid to maintain their beliefs. It warns them about the spiritual dangers of the current age. It reinforces their conviction that withdrawal from mainstream society serves a protective function. They don't evangelize to outsiders because they believe the season for that has passed. They believe the world has entered a phase where corruption is so pervasive that conversion becomes nearly impossible. They focus instead on preserving their own communities, raising their children in the faith, maintaining islands of spiritual purity in a sea of corruption. This isn't defeatism. It's strategic survival. They're maintaining a remnant, preserving a way of life that faithfully follows scriptural teachings, creating examples that may matter in whatever comes next. Their home-based worship bypasses institutional churches they view as compromised. Meeting in homes keeps worship intimate, communal, and free from the corruptions they see in mainstream religious institutions. It follows apostolic patterns while avoiding the pitfalls of organized religion. The question their example poses is profound. If they're correct in their understanding of the times, if they're right about the spiritual state of the modern world, if their interpretation of prophecy accurately describes the current age, then their withdrawal makes complete sense. They're doing exactly what Scripture advises for believers in such circumstances. Their communities function as living demonstrations of scriptural principles applied consistently and completely. They show what society looks like when pride gets eliminated, when communal welfare takes precedence over individual gain, when spiritual values guide all decisions. They've created something remarkably coherent and sustainable. The contrast with mainstream society grows starker each year. As modern culture becomes more fragmented, more materialistic, more spiritually empty, Amish communities remain stable, cohesive, spiritually grounded. As technology accelerates change and disrupts relationships, they maintain continuity and strong bonds. As inequality widens and social safety nets fray, they ensure every member is cared for. Their example challenges assumptions about progress, about what constitutes a good life, about what matters most. They've rejected nearly everything modern society prizes: wealth accumulation, technological advancement, individual achievement, entertainment consumption. And by all accounts, they've created communities with high levels of satisfaction, purpose, and meaning. Their silence on religious matters with outsiders no longer seems mysterious. They've made their choice. They've drawn their boundaries. They're living according to their understanding of what this time requires. They're not trying to convince anyone else. They're simply being faithful to what they believe they're called to do. Whether their theological interpretation is correct remains a matter of individual conviction. But the coherence of their response to that interpretation is undeniable. They've built an entire way of life around specific scriptural understandings, and they've maintained it with remarkable consistency for centuries. Their communities endure while countless others fragment and dissolve. Their faith remains strong while mainstream religion grows increasingly weak and compromised. Their way of life continues to function while modern systems strain and fail in various ways. They pose a question through their very existence. What if they're right? What if their withdrawal, their preservation of a pre-industrial way of life, their refusal to engage with a world they view as spiritually lost, what if all of that flows from accurate understanding of the times? The answer to that question matters less than the example they provide. They show that it's possible to live differently, to resist prevailing cultural currents, to maintain communities based on principles rather than convenience. They demonstrate that faithfulness to ancient teachings remains possible even in modern times. They prove that people can thrive outside systems that seem inescapable to everyone else.